The goal of this lecture is to understand the published results of the Pfizer vaccine against COVID-19. So we really want to get across to you how to read a journal article, particularly in depth with the abstract, and then understand the calculations that were made to show or to demonstrate the efficacy of the vaccine against COVID-19. So what I'm reviewing today is this New England Journal of Medicine article from December 31st, 2020, titled Safety and Efficacy of the BNT162b2 mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. And basically that is the vaccine created by Pfizer. So we've got a lot of information that's provided in this abstract. It is really dense. So some things that you really want to pay attention to include the fact that it was multinational. It was placebo-controlled, so that meant that there was a dual-arm study where you had half the people getting the vaccine and half the people getting placebo. The medical assistants giving the vaccinations did not know whether the individuals had the placebo or the vaccine, hence they were observer blinded. People were 16 years or older that were involved. Again, it was a 1-to-1 ratio. They received 2 doses, 21 days apart, of either the placebo or the vaccine. And here it lists the magnitude of the dose and some characteristics of the vaccine. The primary endpoints were the efficacy of the vaccine against the laboratory confirmed COVID-19 and safety. And before this, there was another paper of a smaller trial that showed safety results. So it goes on to point out how many participants underwent randomization, how many of those actually received injections, and how many of those were with the placebo versus the vaccine. And then points out there were 8 cases of COVID-19 that started at least 7 days after the second dose, and 162 cases after 7 days of the second dose of the placebo. So based on those numbers, and I'll show you how they were calculated later, the vaccine was 95% effective in preventing COVID-19. The interval of that is 90.3 to 97.6. So based on the number of participants, although the calculation is 95%, the confidence is that it's going to be between 90.3 to 97.6%. And then when you look at the different subgroups defined by age, sex, race, ethnicity, et cetera, they all had very similar intervals or magnitudes of vaccine efficiency or efficacy, generally 90 to 100%. It points out some cases of severe COVID-19, 1 in the vaccine recipient, 9 in placebo. And so the conclusion then is in that final paragraph, the 2-dose regimen conferred 95% protection against COVID-19. And they did a safety study over a median of 2 months. And additional information is available at clinicaltrials.gov and listed with the number of the clinical trial. So what we want to do next is go through and really understand, first of all, what were the procedures. So the paper details how the procedures were conducted, how participants were randomly assigned to receive either the dose of the vaccine or a saline placebo, that they received 2 injections 21 days apart of either one delivered into the deltoid muscle. And the site staff who were responsible for the safety evaluation and giving the injections did not know whether the individuals had the vaccine or the placebo. And so the first primary endpoint was the efficacy of this vaccine against confirmed COVID-19, again, at least 7 days after the second dose. So these are things that are all defined up front before a clinical trial, so that when the results come in, then the calculations can be made and determine exactly, based on the primary endpoints, what the overall efficacy was. So here now we see the diagram in which it discussed how many participants were screened, so 44,820. But it turns out 1,272 did actually not undergo the randomization, and it lists a number of different requirements or reasons there. A number did not meet eligibility criteria, so that might include something like age. It might include the fact that they already had the COVID-19 virus in their body and therefore were not eligible. And some had other reasons that they did not participate, or some withdrew, et cetera, et cetera. So you see then the number that actually underwent the randomization was 43,548. Okay, so that's fine. They were randomized. They received a date in which they were supposed to go in and get the vaccine, whether it was the vaccine or the placebo. But you see further that were 99 that were actually not vaccinated. One was due to the fact that they didn't sign the informed consent document. So in the end, we have this number here, 43,448 that were injected. You see the numbers that received the vaccine versus those that received the placebo. And then that number actually is reduced because only 37,706 received the vaccine or the placebo and then had a median follow-up study after 2 months. So the point is, a number of those folks, so almost 6,000, did not, for whatever reason, follow up after 2 months. Okay, so we go on down here and have it divvied out as to how many is almost exactly 50-50 receiving the vaccine on the left-hand side versus receiving the placebo. And then you see that there's a number of people that did not receive dose 2. All right, so that's coming off the left-hand side. And the same with the placebo, a number did not receive dose 2 of the placebo. So in the end, you see the numbers associated with those that actually received both doses of the vaccine or the placebo. And again, it's very close to 50-50. Still, there were a few, 48 on the vaccine side, that discontinued the trial after dose 2, withdrew, did not follow up. One actually died. With the placebo, again, some withdrew, didn't follow up, 2 died, and there were various other reasons. So this table then shows the demographic characteristics. And so one thing you really want to be careful about when you're doing a randomized dual arm clinical trial is you want both of the arms to have very similar characteristics. So you want it broken up equally for gender, for example. As you can see, it's pretty close to 50-50 males versus females. You want it to be pretty equal in terms of the race or ethnicity, country of origin, age group, et cetera, et cetera. As you can see all the way through this table that they did a good job with the randomization, because the characteristics of people receiving the vaccine in the first column compared to the placebo are virtually identical. I guess one person receiving the placebo is 91 versus the oldest is 89 in the vaccine. So again, the same ranges, et cetera, and pretty close to the same amount of obesity as well. Okay, so this is really the key table in the paper that points out the efficacy. And so I've circled here. So the main one is this efficacy endpoint. The primary one is the COVID-19 occurrence at least 7 days after the second dose in participants that didn't have any evidence of infection up to that point. That is 7 days after the second dose. And so the number of cases of people that actually developed COVID-19 then after that point was 8 if they had the vaccine, versus the placebo, it was 162. And so we see what that is. So if you didn't take into account the exact numbers, you'd say, well, only 8 divided by 162 is the small fraction of the people that actually got COVID-19 after receiving the vaccine. So if you want to have the reduction, then you have 1 minus that number to give the fractional reduction. All right, so we see 95%. So I'm really going to focus on that. So let's go through kind of the first calculation. So basically, we had 18,198 people that got the vaccine, satisfied all these other criteria, and 8 of those ended up, after 7 days, after the second dose, getting COVID-19. So that turns out to be 0.044%. If you look at the placebo, eventually 162 people receiving the placebo out of the 18,325 actually developed COVID-19. So that's 0.8840%. You can see so that's roughly 20 times the number of people receiving the vaccine that got it. And so therefore that relates to the 95%, because we're just taking 1 minus the the fraction of people with the vaccine that got COVID-19 divided by the fraction of people that got the placebo. And that's where the 95% number comes in. Okay, and I'm not I'll bother going through this next secondary kind of outcome in the table. Now, here is a cumulative incidence plot. So what you'll notice up here is this is plotted in terms of days after dose 1. So remember, dose 2 occurs 21 days after dose 1. So you can see up here, after dose 1, it's fairly close. The placebo is in blue versus the vaccine is in red. So after the first dose, the number of instances of people getting COVID-19 are pretty close. So you're not really protected during that first dose until roughly 11 days out. Then you can see after 11 days out, that first dose alone protects you reasonably well. That incidence curve is starting to plateau versus the placebo is going. So you'd think that would be kind of a straight line with the placebo, that you're going to have the same risk every day of developing COVID-19. And that's reasonably close to a straight line. So that's kind of the inset that shows the first 21 days. Okay, but overall, the plot below goes a much longer period of time. And so remember, at 21 days, the individuals get the second dose. Well, they've already been pretty well protected, because you can see here at 21 days, you only have a slight increase of people after receiving the second dose. And remember, you receive the second dose at 21 days, but when you do the evaluation of the efficacy, it doesn't really start to 28 days. It starts 7 days after you're given the second dose. And again, you can see that you only have a small increase from 28 days on, and that corresponds to the 0.044% that we saw earlier, versus the increase after 28 days is going to be 0.088% in terms of the placebo. And a lot of that information is also summarized here in the bottom of this table underneath the plot, which also kind of gives the confidence intervals for each of those values. Now, there's a lot more information. I've shown the FDA website where you can download a very detailed report. It's the order of 60 or 70 pages or so that goes and presents a lot more information than was even available in this journal article, which actually had quite a bit of information. Again, the abstract is very dense, but it gave us lots of good information. And so, I haven't really discussed, but there's information about the common side effects of receiving the vaccine. There's a lot more information about what type of side effects occurred after the first dose versus the second dose, and that sort of thing. So all these different documents are available on the website that I linked to on the previous slide. So to summarize, what I really wanted to do in this brief presentation was really to get you to understand how to read a clinical trial abstract and know that this is based on a dual arm randomized trial and how the efficacy of 95% was actually calculated. And again, there's more details on the FDA website. But after this, what you should be able to do is you should be able to go to the New England Journal of Medicine, where there's the publication on the Moderna results, for example. And then there's another journal article on the J&J results. So you should be able to go and read those and provide similar bits of information and really understand how many participants there were and how the efficacy was determined for those vaccines.